George Washington died on December 14th, 1799. He died of what was most likely a throat infection, or, as his physicians would say at the time, an inflammatory sore throat. Sounds pretty brutal. Let me go back just a little bit. George Washington technically died of an infection, but really, he died because his blood had been drained like a fucking racehorse. Allow me to go back a little bit more, actually, to a couple days before George Washington passed. On December 12th of 1799, it was a brutally cold and brutally wet day in Virginia, and although everyone in Washington's family tried to convince him to put on a jacket, he insisted that he was not cold, Mom. George Washington had gone out to ride on his horseback to survey his land. Side note, every website and news article that you read about this topic will say something along the lines of George Washington was supervising his farming activity, or something like he was so dedicated to his daily routine. And before you start wondering if that sounds suspicious, that's because it does sound suspicious, and yes, he was going out to check on his slaves. George Washington was out making sure his slaves were working hard enough, regardless of the, as aforementioned, brutally cold and brutally wet conditions. So sure, feel bad for George Washington who had to ride in a little rain. Don't feel bad for the people that he owned that were forced to work in those conditions. Okay. Back to George Washington's death. He refused to remove his wet clothes when he got back to his estate, as he did not want to be late for family supper. Although, dude, I cannot imagine anyone would have been upset at you. If anything, they probably wondered why he was absolutely fucking soaked from head to toe eating turkey legs. Dude, please just go change. But he wouldn't change. So later that night, he woke up his wife, Martha, and told her that he was feeling extremely under the weather. Something about, I don't know, not being able to breathe or something. He was actually very, very sick, and his lack of breathing capabilities was caused by his inflamed throat. Another side note, bloodletting was a medical practice used regularly prior to the 19th century, and even for some time during the 19th century. Essentially what bloodletting is draining said person's body of the valuable white blood cell dense blood that is vital in combating an infection and or sickness. We know now that it's a very bad idea when someone is on the verge of dying. However, at the time, doctors believed it to be draining the sickness from a person's body. Pretty wild. End of side note. George Washington was given a plethora of treatments, none of which did any good for the infection, I must assume, even though I am not a doctor myself. The Washingtons called for George's physician of 40 years, whose name was James Crake, and while waiting for Crake, an on-site medical professional at Mount Vernon gave George a nice cocktail mix of molasses, butter, and vinegar, as well as drained a whole pint of blood from George's body. George's buddy Crake arrived early the next morning, and immediately they requested for another doctor to be called by the name of Gustavus Brown. Crake's plan of action was to create a blister on George's throat with the intention of removing more fluids. While doing this, the on-site medical professional drained another pint of George Washington's blood. But Dr. Brown was running late, so the Washingtons sent for a third doctor, any doctor someone could find, as well as prepared another scrumptious cocktail of vinegar and sage for George to gargle, and a wet warm towel was placed on George's head. While waiting for the third physician, Crake came to the conclusion that George Washington required a life-saving enema, and so a life-saving enema was administered. And yes, in case you were wondering, another pint of blood was removed from George Washington's body. Watch all those white blood cells disappear, George. As a last-ditch effort, Dr. Crake applied a Hollywood special on George Washington and decided to force him into vomiting, which was unsuccessful. Oh, and before I forget, another pint of blood was taken at this time as well. So, let us recap, shall we? In about a 12-hour period, George Washington was force-fed molasses, butter, vinegar, and sage, given a rectal enema, a finger down his throat, a forced blister on his neck, 32 ounces of blood removed, and a nice warm cloth for his forehead. You know, he probably would have just been better off if the doctors had done nothing at all. And so on December 14th, 1799, George Washington would pass away at home, accompanied by his wife and family. He wrote out a will, and in that will requested that his body be left dead for at least 3 days before being buried, as being buried alive was a fear of his. Rest in peace, George Washington.